Welcome to the Data Coffee Break podcast. I'm Marc.
And I'm Christian.
If you are passionate about data like us, take a seat, relax, and join us to our coffee break where we discuss all things data.
And remember, there are no filters, no PR.
It's just a real life experience. So let's begin. Hi, Christian. Anything crazy you've been doing the last few weeks?
Last few weeks, I think I would say like the last few months.
A few months? Oh my God.
Time flies, considering when was the last time we released the previous episode, right? I was experimenting with these notebooks LLM application, free to use. It has this very interesting podcast feature. Yeah, still very focused for researchers, students, clearly that application, but it's super natural. I might put a short
segment about what is a Data Coffee Break podcast, maybe.
Oh, yes, exactly. Yeah, for Peter, you will be listening now.
Hey, everyone, welcome back. Ready to dive into something new today? We're going to be checking out this podcast, the Data
Oh my God,
Coffee
the voice
Break.
is so great.
Heard of it.
The voice is so
definitely.
natural.
They've got a pretty good following, right? 30 episodes since 2022.
Oh, it's a
Okay.
conversation.
Making data, like all this data stuff we hear about, less intimidating for those of us who don't spend all day coding.
Right, exactly. Like they want analysts, sales engineers, anyone who works with data to be in the loop.
Totally. So it's not just for the hardcore techies. I thought we could kind of dig into what they've got going on, what we liked and all that. What really struck you about their approach?
For me, it's their knack for breaking down these really complex ideas into something
This is
practical,
crazy.
something you can actually use.
And what about you?
The first thing that comes to my mind is something not related to data, not related to computer or whatever. It's being outside. I've been cycling from London to Paris.
Oh, yes, I saw that. How was it?
Enjoyable, but also painful. You get like this fantastic, what they call Avenue Vert, so Green Avenue, in particular on the French side, where you literally on the cycling highway, away from the main road, surrounded by nature for many kilometers. It's really good to do. I would definitely advise anyone who will want to do like in UK/France, this kind of thing, but I'm sure in many other countries, Europe, South America, North America, Asia, you can do the same. Cycling is fantastic.
How long did it take?
We left on Friday after work, stopped by like Gatwick Airport, south of London, outside London, and Saturday went to the coast, took the ferry, obviously, and on Tuesday midday, we were basically in Paris. And in the afternoon, I was taking the Eurostar to be back in London. Not even stayed long. But really enjoyable.
Nice. That's really cool, man.
Yeah. All right. So let's dive into the topic of today, no sport, but about building on some of the previous episodes around generative AI and large language models, right? What we have seen in the past few months, 18 months, 2 years, is the rise of some companies going for commercial purpose in terms of developing large language model and Gen AI tools overall. But there is also a very big and thriving community of what we can call open source LLM, open LLMs, right?
Exactly. As you mentioned, we have, of course, OpenAI. Everyone knows about ChatGPT, GPT. That's considered a closed model. But also we have Anthropic, Google, big players there, also doing their own version of the closed models, this massive black box LLMs. And we started looking at open LLMs. The biggest ones, of course, are Mistral, Llama from Meta, which just a couple of days ago, we just saw version 3.2. Gemma from Google, and a very big repository of open source LLMs, which is Hugging Face, right?
Exactly. And you mentioned Mistral as an example, who has an open LLM. But from many of our listeners, they know Mistral is a startup. They have an offering, like companies can pay for the service for the language model and using the API, etc. So what can be confusing for many is, why is it an open LLM, but it's still a commercial link to that? I think that would be good to get into that first, right?
Yes, let's start from there. When we code open LLM, It's actually what we call the open weights. And essentially, as you have the publicly available code, most of the cases, you have access to the architecture, like how was this used? I mean, if there's in transformers architecture or other techniques. But the weights is quite important because those weights, basically, those are the parameters that the model learned during the initial training or massive data sets. Right? So you have the parameters that accompany the training of the model, which means that the users of those models can leverage the existing knowledge without having to train it from scratch. That is quite a big thing. Data that what was used for training may or may not be open, right? That's usually not open, what data sets were used for training. But the weights, that is quite a thing, right? It's like, I give you the parameters that I used to train the model, and why am I getting these results without you need to do like a massive training. So you can just take them and tweak them to your own purpose, right? And start creating your own versions on top of those. As I mentioned, the Llama, Falcon, they're all open weights models. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yes. Now, why is this important, or why they become quite more mainstream, is because we see them performing the same or very similar to these large, let's say, closed models when it comes to common tasks like summarization, classifications. The benchmarks from these models now are almost at the same as those other big closed models, right? Just you look at Llama or Gemma from Google, they're quite high in the benchmarks.
So in this case, you mentioned benchmarks such as LMCs, right? Kind of leaderboard benchmark.
The chatbot arena.
The chatbots are correct.
Some people are like, well, I prefer to download it into my own. That's another angle if you want, right? What are the angles that we see? One is the ability to see the parameters, the fact that they are free. Some of them may have specific licenses, but in general, they are free to use. The other thing I was going to mention there is that they are very good option for running on device, because these models are already pre-trained, which means that the model sizes are generally smaller, or you don't need a massive amount of GPUs to get results out of them. So when it comes to having an on-device, and device can be your laptop, right? Or not necessarily like a phone. That's also quite an attractive use of the models.
Absolutely, yeah. But they obviously have some kind of disadvantage I see in some aspect, and maybe after we can compare that with some of the closed models and the most commercial one. Like, so you mentioned like the performance obviously can be discussed. Like it seems like the closed models and the big commercial entities, they will go for having so much resources to develop. Usually they will be more cutting edge and better performance. That's my point of view from what I've seen. There is the aspect of having less support, documentation around those ones.
Yes.
So you will have to be more technical overall as well. As you mentioned, like you can download it, you can use it on your device, but that require much more technical skills, in my point of view, give you more flexibility, more technical skills, while commercial models, fantastic documentation, very robust APIs that help you to scale and build very easily products on top of it. So that's what I've seen so far. I don't know if you've seen the same or not.
Yes, I think you point out very well. Maintenance and support is quite a big thing. If we go a bit more holistic, one of the things that it's not like a downside, but it's more of a risk. They have a security risk.
Oh, yeah,
and
absolutely.
Bias risk, right? Especially with models that you have access to the architecture or code, those can be used by malicious actors to generate harmful content, or you can have this bias amplification where you can inherit certain biases and make them much wider spread, right? So I think it's riskier.
I agree with you, because with commercial closed models, they built all the securities around it, really focusing on the risk and security part. They built all the tools and security around it, while in open models, you can have some people asking all to build a biolab. That's an extreme, right?
Yes.
And if you build that as part of the product for your company, and some people use it for illegal purposes, I think from a legal standpoint, your company might be liable. I'm thinking like in a commercial idea where you use those models, those open models, to build your own product on top of it and commercialize it, and you can be liable for those aspects. That's
definitely
one major risk.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. So that's why Meta and Mistral have very clear terms of use, similar to the MIT licenses that we see now at Code. Especially in Europe, these open source models that you can deploy not necessarily on device, but even on your cloud environments are now much more popular. I'm talking about, let's say, say Llama 3.1 Instruct or now Llama 3.2 because of data sovereignty and regulations.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's a big topic. Right? The EU is it's one of the, I would say,
at the forefront in terms of this kind of legal, those regulations.
That is the thing. Singapore, EU are leading the way, and that means as well that in Europe we don't get certain model versions, certain features. That's perhaps the debate whether this is correct or not. That's for another episode. But definitely organizations that are highly regulated, that requires that the data don't leave the, let's say, the country or where it's processed, these models are a really good sweet spot, right? Because as we were saying at the beginning of the episode, they can do very well summarization, they can do very well classification, chat, and the data will never leave because you're not going to access a large foundation model like GPT or Gemini in this case.
Absolutely. I want to go back to the second point you mentioned, bias. I mean, the grand idea of large language model is the output that the language model is going to give you is based on the training data. If your training data is specifically skewed on one side or the other, you will have an output that can be biased. Closed models tend to be better in that extent because they have like usually teams dedicated for about checking around the data is biased, collecting the right data, providing synthetic data that is going to balance the result as well, if I'm correct or not.
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, which is something you might like in the open models, and you might get a risk having some bias. Depending on your use case, might not be an issue, but that could be something to consider as well. When you are part of an organization, you want to potentially select an open model, but you have to be conscious of those risks.
Yes. I do think as well that, like they always say that technology comes in cycles, right? And the cycle of AI in a lot of respects reminds me, on this topic in particular, right? On the on open source coding versus closed coding. Let's think about .NET back in the early 2000s, where Microsoft, of course, was the one that has the source code, and perhaps it's not as harsh as this one because the regulations of the code have evolved a lot, but regulators in the end for these biases, for example, right? What organizations like a large enterprise liked having Microsoft or an Oracle or IBM code is because there is some accountability on that, right? So they have accountability versus when you have a community packages or libraries that might or may not be, this accountability. So I want to believe that we have learned quite a lot out of those examples that I was giving from 20-something years ago. The community is the one that is actually auto-regulating itself to an extent, right? And that's why I think Hugging Face, it's such an important pillar here, such an important piece of the puzzle. Not for them to be regulating. Of course, I'm not giving any accountability of how malicious or not malicious some of these community LLMs are, but providing that hub, where you can go and look at and get access to pre-trained models that are open, I think that's really important.
We got to the point.
Yes, exactly. There is a risk that organizations would prefer the closed models for those reasons, the accountability and the dedicated teams. But in the end, the community will always exist, right? You will always have a community and community projects and everything.
Absolutely. It's a cornerstone here.
So to finalize this short talk, I wanted to give you some actionable examples. So let's say if I want to have a comparison between open LLMs, again, Mistral, the Llamas versus a closed LLM like GPT-4, Gemini. When would I use them?
Different criteria, yeah, and you need to take into consideration. We brushed quite a few of them. Maybe not all, but quite a few of them. Costs-wise, I read quite a few articles saying open LLMs will be higher in cost in the short term. You have to hire more technical engineers to be able to deploy those ones, to be able to fine-tune those ones. But in the long run, as you won't be paying a commercial use most of the time, you should save more money.
Yes, exactly. Or just get them through your Hugging Face API key, right? So when it comes to cost of use, it's generally free. Well, we say free versus the subscription fees and usage costs of the open models. Customizations, again, like when you need to fine-tune something like GPT or Gemini, you are restricted to the APIs, right? Just restrict. You also don't have as much flexibility of modification, adaptation of the low ranking, for example, the LoRa's that you can have in open LLMs. Transparency, right? Obviously, yes. If you would like to have full transparency and access to the source code, open LLMs are your choice versus the closed models. I would say as well, let's think about use cases, right?
So use cases that can be very interesting that we found around is when you have niche programming languages and you want to do some code generation, you might be better off having open LLMs. I'm sure on Hugging Face you can find some of them focusing on, what is this programming language is in financial services? Cobalt?
Cobalt, yeah.
That might be one of them.
And you are super right there. The other day I was looking at when it comes to niche and somehow related, let's say, use cases to coding. I was looking at one model in Hugging Face. I'm sorry, I just don't remember the name. But if someone remembers, please send us a message in the comments. It was a model trained specifically to look at charts and generate a description of those. And it can do very crazy charts. I'm talking about waterfalls or things just by looking. This was a multimodal model that was trained on images, right? And it was trained just for that. Imagine that you need a model that can describe charts and even give you some code.
Maybe was it a SQL Coder 2? Let me check again. SQL Coder is a 15 billion parameters model that outperform GPT.
Matcha Chart QA.
Far away.
Matcha Chart QA.
It's a different one.
Matcha Chart QA is a fine-tune of an already fine-tuned model called Chart QA that basically gives you chart to text. Then you can see the contribution models in Hugging Face. But yeah, so basically it's
a fantastic example of saying like you need to go for like specialized model that is only available as far as I know on Hugging Face you need to use a specialized model to be able to answer this specific use case. That can be super powerful, of course.
Exactly. This was a narrower model on top of Chart QA, which is another fine-tuned model. Yes, so it's your example of fine-tuning for a very niche programming language. You remind me of this one, which is, another example of a very niche use case.
Yeah, another use I read about some startups who are building models around, so that's going to be also quite commercial, is legal aspects. Obviously, it's highly differentiated based on which country it operates. So yeah, you might be having a better fit as going for commercial models. I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know what you think on that.
So I think documents that have a very standard formatting, you might be good with a GPT 4.0 or a Gemini Flash, because the inference for them is quite cheap and you can do that very quickly. Basically, if you don't need a lot of training on those documents, right? It's a document that has a standard all the time, getting the same
format, type of like
the same formatting. You can
articles,
you can get away with prompt engineering But to your point, if you need some fine-tuning to understand nuances within the documents, or the documents change in nature or format, then yes, an open LLM might be the way to fine-tune it. Another use case that we see, as I was telling you about the on-device, we've seen this Apple Intelligence. Apple trained their own LLMs. Right? They don't disclose which model they use to train that, but they deploy it on device. So most likely they either use their own version of large language models, or they took the weights from an open LLM and then they created their own wrappers on it, right? So Apple Intelligence, let's say for the summarization, classification tasks that were shown in the demos, it's using on device. And then whenever the task requires much more processing power or is too complex or goes beyond those trained models, you get a prompt whether you would like to go and ask ChatGPT, right? That really cool example how you can leverage both, right?
Yeah, that's going to be like a future where you will get this kind of flexibility, and applications that are going to be built will take into consideration that the question or the task will lead to the use of one or another model that is going to be better suited for this task specifically.
Exactly. Agree. So, yes, I guess the last one would be something like healthcare.
I mean, I guess because we're speaking about private patient data, it has to be more around, as you were pointing out, like sovereignty, or at least like the data not leaving usually the premise of the company. So that kind of really skew towards having an open LLM where you will be able to make sure like it reside in your infrastructure. That's what I see. After, I don't have I'm sure, I mean, obviously you have to go for models that are more adapted for this kind of use case as well. So that really skew towards open models.
I think step number one will be to go to Hugging Face and see if there is already one model adapted there. Then take it from there. I think the takeaway from the episode is that we see these open LLMs, as we were saying, getting pretty much same performance or very similar performance for common tasks than, up close or let's say more mainstream models. So pick the one based on your requirements, on your use case.
Be smart.
Leverage. I guess my question to you will be like, then we are seeing more and more, or do you see the world where you have multiple LLMs in one single application?
As I was pointing out before, depending on the task you're going to carry out, you might have a first step at figuring out which LLM to use to have the most accurate and potentially the fastest answer, depending on what's the priority. I don't know if the most important trade-off is speed over accuracy.
Yeah,
for some use cases.
When we were talking about the search on vectors, right? Depending on which method you use, you have like a faster response, but your recall, let's say your results might not be super accurate versus waiting for it. This would give for a good episode on agents. We can talk about that maybe on the next episode. But until then,
thank you very much, Christian. That was fantastic.
Thanks for listening to this episode. This podcast represents our views and not the ones of our employers.
Our mission at the Data Coffee Break podcast is to inform you and help you grow in this always changing data field.
Follow us and get into the conversation with the community on our LinkedIn page and Instagram.
See you next Tuesday, and until then, keep your data caffeinated.